guys doing? That's some wonderful, wonderful dissonance right there. That just lives on such a edge. If you haven't surmised, we're digging into the Sons of Detroit. I'm not going to do just exclusively that. I'm going to bounce around here, but this felt like a good episode to come and follow today with Yusef LATEEF. Again, one of the great Detroit jazz men. And Donald Byrd, we talked about. I actually covered Paul Chambers a few weeks ago on the Miles First Quintet Sidemen with Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones. And then I did an episode on the Jones Brothers that were also Detroit origin. Then I did Donald Byrd yesterday. And so now we're going to dig into Yusef LATEEF. And Bird's kind of renowned for that groove that just propels his stuff. And Yusef LATEEF's niche is he was a multi-instrumentalist, spiritualist. He became a Muslim at 1959 or so, pretty young age, maybe even younger than that, I can't recall. But his name was Yusef LATEEF for most of his professional career, if not all of it. He was born actually in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1920. And one of the real threads I've started to notice here in doing these biographies, and it's something I've always touched on and had some grasp on, but haven't really quite seen it as clearly since I've been doing these bios, is these guys are all born in the 20s, from the 50s and 60s. All of them. They're all born 1920, 22, 24. Usually not even the late 20s. Usually it's always late teens and anything but early mid-20s. And it's been kind of insightful because that puts them as young boys, preteens, and teenagers going into the Depression. And if there's one thing you can layer on top of the black experience in America that can really ratchet it up 50-fold, it's that Great Depression. The unemployment lines that were always long for blacks, the jobs that were once available to blacks, suddenly they're at the end of a much longer unemployment line. And suddenly the jobs that they once could have are now being filled by desperate white people. And it leads to a level of poverty in black America. And these young kids hustled their way through it. They shucked and jived and polished shoes and hustled like Oliver Twist. And there's a strong sense of family and community in the black community in America. And thankfully, I'm sure a lot of them housed each other. And that goes back to the days of slavery, where there was a sense of community and we're going to bind together. We're not going to leave people out in the street. But I'm sure many people still were left very without option. And so part of the great sorrow that I'm hearing in these jazzmen in the 50s into the 60s is actually adding another layer of sorrow and desperation that I don't hear in other generations of jazzmen. The guys that come up in the 60s and in the 70s, their expression, they're still have a life to deal with. But I think that layer of the Depression being part of these 1950s and early 60s players, being such a prominent part of their coming into the world, first recognizing self at 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, and living in such desperate, dire straits. And Detroit does become a haven of sorts. It had a huge black population, and does still today. And it also is part of the fabric of the city because it's what leads to the greatest degree of white flight. And for those of you who aren't American overseas, American cities, especially in the Rust Belt on the East Coast, experienced white flight in the 50s and 60s after the war, as more and more minorities moved up from the South and concentrated in inner city neighborhoods. The white people in those neighborhoods more and more left. And it turns out even places like New York City were redlining districts, making it hard for minorities to buy housing outside of certain neighborhoods, and intentionally knowing that this would blight that neighborhood so that industry and business could come in, real estate, and buy the stuff for a song and a dance 10 years from now, move all these people out, displace them somewhere else, and then redline that area and eventually kick them out of there again. They were being used as a part of urban renewal to drive property values down so that we can sweep up this property, rebuild it, and make a killing on it once again. It's as ugly as stealing the land from the natives in the first place. Wealth never wants to pay for nothing. The people who can most afford to pay for things least want to. What an ugly legacy. And the blacks are victims of this across the East Coast. That being said, Detroit was a center of manufacturing. Between the wars, Detroit's probably the third most important city in America behind New York and Chicago. LA is just coming into its own after the war, after the Second War, and Frisco, after the First World War, had just had earthquakes. It was kind of rebuilding itself. The West Coast cities haven't really come to prominence between the wars. It's Chicago, it's New York, and it's Detroit. And Detroit and Chicago are on that Great Lakes seaway out to the Atlantic, so it allowed them to have access to the interior of the continent and be able to ship goods and merchandise. And there was laborers coming in from Eastern Europe and around the world, and blacks were migrating up from the South to pick up the jobs that were left over. And Detroit ends up being this place that attracted a lot of African Americans, and they actually were able to establish a community and a standard of living much higher than what most of the rest of the country had to offer to black Americans. It's a bit of a black mecca almost, because of the employment opportunities, because of the neighborhoods that they were growing in and now populating heavily and having some political power. And so Detroit's this kind of epicenter, and it's partly why we see such a huge wave of black jazz musicians from Detroit. Is it's become the Harlem of the 30s and the 40s. Harlem is a small encased area on the northern tip of Manhattan. It doesn't have quite the same growth potential and connection to manufacturing. New York actually starts to lose its manufacturing in this time period, but Detroit, with the automobile industry, is just churning out employment opportunities, and it actually leads to guys like Donald Byrd and Yusef LATEEF having a fantastic opportunity to educate themselves. And even post-secondary education, these guys both went to Wayne University. They both ended up going to the Manhattan School of Music. Yusef LATEEF, his family, after being born in Chattanooga in 1925, they moved to Detroit. And he actually changes the last name of the family, his father, from Huddleston to Evans. So this guy's name now is actually William Evans, Bill Evans. And we all know there's another Bill Evans in jazz. And so his move to becoming a Muslim, becoming Yusef LATEEF, was beneficial in that way alone. It kind of gave him a unique identity, a unique marker, and jazz doesn't have two Bill Evans, as it were. He originally starts playing the alto because he wanted to play like Lester Young. Ends up moving to the tenor, where he found himself far more kind of comfortable, and learns to play the flute really well, and plays the flute throughout his career. He also plays the oboe, a jazz instrument you don't hear very often, and the bassoon, which is a bigger, more baritone-ish, ranged reed instrument. And then he also plays a lot of foreign instruments. He plays the bamboo flute from Asia. He plays for the Shehnai from India, which is like an Indian clarinet of sorts that was played at a lot of spiritual gatherings. He plays the Jewish shotar, which is like the ram's horn. He plays the zun, which is this Chinese pottery. You play the little holes on the bowl. The argul, which is an Egyptian Middle Eastern flute, and then of course the koto, which is a Japanese kind of stringed harp, as it were. So he's got this real Middle Eastern, Far Eastern, subcontinent instrumental knowledge and ability to play all these instruments. And so more than anybody else, Yusef LATEEF brings the world to jazz, and he kind of creates some of the first world music, as it were. And post-World War II, we are now in this new global age. For the first time, flight is a common occurrence in the 50s. The technology and the innovations that happened during war leak over into the private sector, and now we have telecommunications, and we're putting up satellites, and these big cities with ports, and the ocean liners are now giving way to the great transatlantic flights, and television's coming in. The whole world's starting to become more familiar with itself. And a guy like young Yusef LATEEF takes instruments from all these exotic places and starts to make them less exotic by incorporating them into the great African American experience here in America. And he was way kind of ahead of his time. This is before the new age wave of world music as we know today. This is pre even the Beatles and that explosion of Beatlemania, which becomes this global phenomenon. Yusef LATEEF is seeing this global new community and envisioning it and bringing it into a sound already in the mid-50s. We'll move on a little bit here. He, of course, being with Detroit, played with Milt Jackson a lot, Paul Chambers, Elvin Jones, Kenny Burrell. He did go to Wayne University. In 1960, he goes to the Manhattan School of Music while he's already a fairly established musician. And by 1970, he has his bachelor's and his master's in music. So again, like Bird, he's a very well-educated black man that comes from Detroit, a place where a black man did have enough community and property and wealth to have schooling and the potential for secondary education. And Detroit was this great experiment. And the white flight undermines the tax base of the city. And it causes services to decrease, policing to decrease, what you offer to the parks and how you often redo your streets and replace the lighting in the neighborhoods. All these things, as the wealthier white tax base leaves, the tax base of the city shrinks. The city becomes less safe, becomes more appealing to minorities and the impoverished. As the wealth leaves, the property values go down, and you end up getting a more and more undesirable element that's not based on race, but it's based on poverty and desperation. So you have waves of kind of poor, desperate people sweeping up low-income housing, and it's draining the entire neighborhood and bringing the entire city's wealth down to the point where Detroit goes through one of the greatest underminings and bankruptcies, and the entire city gets obliterated. Block after block has been torn down to being bare grass fields again. Public gardens where people are growing melons and potatoes. Entire blocks have had water and heat and gas and services cut off, and it's now become urban rural in large swaths of urban Detroit. The blight was so incredible. Not even New York experiences what Detroit does in the 80s and the 90s, and as manufacturing starts to leave for overseas, and as the black community starts becoming even more undermined and more unemployment starts to rise, Detroit goes through some ugly situations. And race and black community, it's all a part of the fabric of this nation's history. And jazz is speaking on this throughout this whole time. Let's move on. I want to speak about in 1957, Yusef LATEEF starts recording with Savoy, Herman Lubinsky's label. And right off the bat, you can see there's some interesting instruments on the cover of this one. This is a German pressing of this. Yusef LATEEF's early Savoys almost always fetch hundreds of dollars. And there's a few actually I haven't managed to track down. There's one called The Fabric of Jazz. I have not found that one yet for a price I can afford, or a reissue that I wanted. There's also another one called Stablemates, where he shares one side with AK Salim, the other side is Yusef LATEEF. I haven't picked that one up either. I had a chance to win it at auction, and I bid too low, and I kicked myself ever since. But again, you can really feel the ethnic vibes right off from his first album, the opening moments of it. And he is as innovative in this sense as any of the greats in jazz that innovate. You know, Parker brought what he brings, Monk brought what he brings, but Yusef brings this to the music, and it ends up becoming a big part of the 60s avant-garde and the spiritual jazz movement. A lot of Yusef's creations and grafting into jazz is borrowed by Pharoah Saunders, is borrowed by John Coltrane. When you hear records like Africa Brass, you can't not recognize that Yusef LATEEF is in part responsible for that movement and that looking to the East and that using Eastern instrumentation. Herman Lubinsky and Savoy give him like 6 sessions, 57, 58. So he puts out a lot of stuff. This is Jazz for the Thinkers, Yusef LATEEF and His Men. It's a fine record. He plays a lot with the Detroit guys. This has Curtis Fuller, Hugh Lawson, Louis Hayes, and Ernie Farrell on it. This is the sounds of nature, Yusef LATEEF. This is 12,120. He shows up at Savoy probably around 12,100. 12,103. So Savoy's about 103 releases into their 12,000 series when Yusef LATEEF shows up. And by 12,050, 45, 50 releases later, Yusef has 6 LPs in that Savoy section of their discography from 57, 58 into 59. Some of the last ones come out after he's already left the label for Prestige, but again, Yusef, that's just part of the sound he's going for. And there's still a swing to it. Let's see who's playing on this one with him. Ozzy Cadena is producing, Rie Van Gelder's engineering, Wilbur Hardin, who he plays with a lot, is playing flugelhorn, Hugh Lawson on the piano, Ernie Farrow's on the bass, and Oliver Jackson's on the drums. So that's a band you see with Yusef quite a bit at this point of his career. And then I want to bring him back to the record I played at the opening here. This is Prayer for the East. It's probably his 4th release on Savoy. And it's just got this dense wave of mosquito attacking bumblebees soaring through a thick moistened air of incense and prayer smoke. And boy, the temple that you're about to enter into sure seems mystical. And it's gonna swing. He's gonna take it out of that dark, and he's gonna swing the light around. And there comes the clarity of the groove. And that's how you take dissonance and go from the edges and then find the center, find a groove, find a melody. The Beatles, George Martin, were the masters of, we're going to take something with a great deal of dissonance that in a pop sensibility you shouldn't be allowed to do, but we're going to flip it so on its head. A Day in the Life is a great example that the dissonance of that great orchestral surge will be countered by woke up, got out of bed, dragged the comb across my head. You can do anything if you know how to resolve the tension. That's, to me, one of the great elements of songwriting. Groove is important, improvisation, melody is important, but to me, tension and resolve is what creates hooks. You can have some of the other elements and it can be listenable, but it doesn't make it memorable. What makes a great song memorable is tension and resolve. It needs to have a bit of a minor or a dissonance or an edge to it that's a little bit uncomfortable, and the listener's like, why am I unsafe here? And then it's going to hit that bridge and that chorus and blossom into the major, into the full resolve of the tonic. And it's going to feel so wonderful, and it's going to be very subliminal, what I'm saying. Most people aren't going to sit down breaking down the dissonance and the resolve. It's not going to, it's just a feeling. And a lot of the great pop songs, as annoying as they can be, especially after the 30-second listen, you're like, well, I don't want to hear that again. They still often so borrow from kind of a verse that has some tension or some minor element to it that gives it kind of a darkness, and then a lighter, bright, more full-sounding major will often offset that as the, or even just going back to the root. You know, you can create your verse using the intervals of the chord, and then you come back to the root for the chorus, and it's like, ah. And so that stuff, maybe it's a little musical, detail-oriented in a way, but I think in a lot of ways it's important. Let's take a quick look at some of the side work he does. He's not a prolific guy as a sideman, but in 62, I think 63, he does join the Cannonball Adderley quintet, or sextet at some points. This is the Cannonball Adderley Sextet in New York on Riverside. It's a beautiful little copy of that. Village Vanguard, beautiful, beautiful pressing. This is at the Jazz Workshop. And the band here is Nat, Cannonball, Nat, his brother, Yusef LATEEF, Joe Zawinul on piano, Sam Jones on the bass, and Louis Hayes on the drums. Absolutely great group. This is Nippon Soul. And of course, Nippon was a mid-20th century name for Japan. And again, if you're going to attempt to do something with an Eastern flair to it, or some African sounds, you want to have Yusef LATEEF on board. Randy Weston does this African suite later in late 60s. Uhuru Africa. He brings Yusef LATEEF on board. AK Salim, does a record in the late 60s called Afro Soul. He brings in Yusef LATEEF. Donald Byrd, of course, the great Detroit trumpeter we talked about yesterday. He has Yusef on his debut recording, or maybe his second. I can't remember if this is before the Savoy or the Savoy was first. And I think this might have been recorded before the Savoy one, but Transition sat on it for a few months. The Savoy one comes out, and then a few Transition releases come out. It's all 55, 56 in that era. Paul Chambers, first baseman, probably 1958, 59. He hires his buddy from Detroit to play with him. Art Blakey, he decides to do a record called Afrobeat, the African Beat. And who would be a good guy to bring in to do such a record? Oh, I don't know. Maybe Yusef LATEEF. And that record's filled with interesting instruments from around the world. And so you got Solomon Alori, Joe Montego, Chief Bay, James Ola, Fulami. Just a real interesting lineup of people. Louis Hayes, the great drummer, makes this record with Nat Adderley, Yusef LATEEF, Barry Harris, Sam Jones. This is actually an outstanding record, also on the VJ label. Sonny Red does this record with Blue Mitchell, Barry Harris, and Yusef. This is called Breezing. It's on the Jazzland imprint, which is the Riverside subsidiary. Probably 1960, 61 in there. Doug Watkins, the great bass player who plays on Transition and on Prestige. He hires Yusef to make this record with him. And then this boss of the Soulstream trombone, Curtis Fuller, is on Warwick label. Yusef's on this as well. And it's actually Freddie Hubbard that kind of shines on this record. Hubbard's young and just full of fire. But as he's winding up his contract with Savoy, he's already starting to dabble and record for New Jazz, the Prestige label. And Yusef LATEEF has a number of records that do get issued on Prestige and New Jazz. This one here is one of them. This, of course, would be the New Jazz version of this. Here he's playing Take the A Train, the Ellington song. And the flute just gives it a light, ethereal, almost eastern sunset, minarets on the horizon, camels crossing the desert. It's funny how he can inflect color and global sand into a song that was all concrete. Yusef, Hardin, Lawson, Pharoah Jackson, so it's pretty much the same group from the Savoy era, but you do have Chinese gongs on here, balloon, bells, 7-Up bottle, Turkish finger cymbals. There's some interesting instrumentation going on. This is New Jazz number 8261, which means it was pretty late in the New Jazz series, and it was also Prestige 7122, so probably 59 or so that one's being done. Very early on at New Jazz, he does this Other Sounds 8218. And his records can fetch pretty good money. You know, some of the guys that are toughest to collect are the ones who have a fairly decent following, but haven't been reissued a ton. It's not really hard to collect all the Coltrane stuff. It's all available and has been available almost every decade. So there's copies and pressings from different various places to find that stuff. A guy like Yusef, some of his albums haven't been reissued very often at all. This has Wilbur Hart and Hugh Lawson, the same group pretty much. Again, real world sounds. Strange instruments are being employed. He's very successful, though, at taking a lot of these interesting, unique instruments and making them accessible. And again, that's to me one of the key elements of being innovative, is you're only as innovative as you are listenable. So you can push the boundaries as far as the fuck you want, but if no one's listening to it, you didn't really do nothing. You know, to push the boundaries and have people love it and embrace it, that's memorable. Within You Without You, again by the Beatles. The Beatles were so good at embracing new sounds, but still making it have a sensibility of popular music. A lot of the same people are on this again. We do add Lonnie Hillier on the trumpet. Yusef plays oboe on this one some. Herman Wright's playing the bass now. This one, I believe, has Prestige issuing as well. I only have the New Jazz number on here because that's what this one is, but I'm pretty sure that one also was issued in the 7100 series somewhere. Prestige is a very convoluted beast. This is another great New Jazz record. I have a rather beat up album cover here, sadly, but the record actually plays fine. This is Into Something. Yusef LaTeef, Barry Harris, Herman Wright, and Elvin Jones, so it's actually just a quartet. And I'm trying to remember if Barry Harris is also a Detroit guy. I think he might be. He's certainly showing up on a lot of these Detroit guys' sessions, but this one seems to have a bit more of a conventional edge to it right off the bat. Partly because you're in a quartet setting. This is 7447 Prestige. Yusef LaTeef Plays for Lovers, and Be Forewarned. This is all stuff that's been reissued before. It's culled from numerous different records, but it's certainly not a record anybody would have to have. And then Yusef LaTeef Eastern Sounds. This is Prestige 7319, and This one might also have a New Jazz issue as well. Even which came first, New Jazz or Prestige, starts to become a very convoluted thing at some point with Prestige and New Jazz. But this is a great record. Another one that's tough to come by. He has Lex Humphries, Ernie Farrell, Barry Harris playing with him on this one. And so this takes him up to about 1960, maybe 61. So he's pretty much Savoy 57, 58, Prestige 59, 60. There's a little crossover there. This is probably 1957. Argo 634. Argo starts at 600. So this can't be much later than 57. It's a live show. And it's got a great album cover. Live at Cranbrook. I'm not sure if that's a school or if that's just a town name. It's got Terry Pollard on it, she's a Bethlehem tenant. She's a great player. She plays the vibes on the piano. Here she's playing piano. Frank Morelli on baritone sax. William Austin on bass and rebab. What's a rebab? I don't know. And Frank Gant on drums, gong, and finger cymbals. Matt Hentoff does a long review here. We got some long songs here. Morning here is 15 minutes long. Interesting session. I've only listened to this one a couple times. It's a tough record to come by on Argo. And it's great Yusef LATEEF. You can't really go wrong with it. 1960, 61. He does a couple records for Riverside. This is the Centaur on the Phoenix, the big sound of Yusef LATEEF. And this has Clark Terry, Richard Williams, Curtis Fuller, Tate Houston, this is Joe Zawinul, Josiah Taylor, Ben Tucker, Lex Humphries, recorded in 1960 in New York. One of those weird teal labeled Riverside records. And that kind of right there, you could be driving along in a car, flip on a jazz station, hear that. That kind of urban, Mediterranean jazz, it's often Yusef LATEEF. You know, it's got some hummus sitting nearby it on the bus station. You know, you're in the back of the bus and there's baba ganoush everywhere. It's just got that feel to it. You know, it's you feel like you could almost be shopping in a Moroccan bazaar, and that's pretty cool. This one's on New Riverside 325. So he's a fairly prolific guy in that sense of the word. He makes quite a few records. This one was what? Riverside. They're both fairly close together. On flute, on tenor, on oboe. Really nice cover. Nice layout. If we look at the group here, Yusef, Lawson, Wright, Humphries, and Ron Carter playing cello. Interesting. There's Yusef, there's Ron Carter, and I'm guessing that's Lex Humphries. Yep, it is. And I think this record kind of leads us into where he goes next. He signs with Impulse. And there's no question that Yusef LATEEF has had some impact on John Coltrane. And Coltrane, one of the first things he does at Impulse is Africa Brass, which borrows some of this innovation that Yusef brought to jazz in 57, 58. And so when he offered a contract at Impulse, I'm not saying he jumped at it, but I'd have to guess it wasn't too hard of a thought process for him. I'm going to straighten these out real quick here. So, 1962 or so, He's at Impulse. And this is Jazz Round the World. And who better to comment on Jazz Round the World than the great Yusef LATEEF. It's a beautiful little pressing. We're going right back to that Savoy, Prayer to the East. There's that sound, that droning dissonance, and he'll find some resolution here. He's playing the oboe, he's playing the bassoon, he's got Richard Williams on trumpet, Hugh Lawson, Ernie Barrows, and Lex Humphreys. Abana, India, Yusef's French brother, the Volga rhythm song. He really is going all over the world with this. Ringo Oyawaki, Raisins and Almonds. He just really obviously has a global spirituality to him that is going to embrace what the jet set is bringing to us. You can be a jet setter and just go to Nice in the south of France and drink your champagne and never really touch the fabric of the world. Or you can recognize that, wow, the Congo Basin's at my fingertips. Burma, the Mekong, the Nile, all these great river basins with these great cultures and instruments and the human heritage that really we're all linked to is something now available to us all. This is the golden flute of Yusef LATEEF, and now we're Impulse number 125. This is much later. He's still playing with Herman Wright, Hugh Lawson, and Roy Brooks. This is 1966. It's just beautiful stuff. Contemplative, moody, mystical, and he definitely seems to attract a certain listener. You know, the Coltrane, Pharoah Saunders, Ornette Coleman, those are the guys who love Yusef LATEEF, and in a way, he's a bit of a tonal center for those people. A lot of those people like some pretty out stuff, and as ethnic and as colorful as Yusef LATEEF is, he doesn't abandon melody. He doesn't abandon groove. He's always improvising within the framework and structure that jazz provides. And so I think he tricks some of the out people into thinking he's out, but he's never really out. He's always, again, centered and melodic. A lot of the same people, again, Richard Williams, Mike Knock on piano, Ernie Farrell on bass, and James Black on the drums. This is live at Pep's, Impulse A69, probably 1962. Recorded 64, so I'm a little off there. 69, so Impulse starts in 60, so by 64 they got 70 releases out. Creed Taylor, I'm pretty sure, is gone by this point. Yeah, it's produced by Bob Thiel, and Rudy Van Gelder is doing, of course, Impulse sessions at this point. Van Gelder's reach in the black community is pretty astounding. And I think one of the things that doesn't get mentioned, and I've mentioned it once or twice, is part of why Rudy Van Gelder ends up being the guy at the helm of so many black jazz recordings, is he was a guy that didn't mind recording black artists. And I think they were lined up around the block week after week to record at Van Gelder, Savoy, Riverside a little bit, Blue Note, Prestige, Impulse, label after label, some Verve stuff. They all wanted him, but partly because there was no issue of, is this going to be too black for Sony Studios? Is Columbia going to be like, no, we don't really want, we don't got time for that? There was a guarantee if this guy was going to do it, race wasn't going to be an issue here. And we got to always recall that these are the factors and the economic principles that are guiding the Jews that are running the jazz industry and the blacks who are making it. It was a very tenuous setup at all times. And a guy like Van Gelder, who had a kind of a no questions open door policy, he was a minority himself, so he didn't really sweat it. You just went there. There wasn't a lot of other choices, you know. And thank God for Van Gelder. I'm not in any way diminishing him, but I don't think it's always we're going to Van Gelder because he's the best engineer or the only engineer that can do this. It was just, that was what was available, and consistently you knew what you were going to get. This is 1984, Yusef LATEEF. From 1965, A84. Got a lot of the same musicians. He plays some Ellington on here. Great little record. This is Psychomotus, I guess is how you say that. Yusef LATEEF, A92. A nice late, probably 66. And if you like Coltrane in the Africa Brass area, if you like Coltrane when he was going through Olay and Crescent, you know, 58, 59, 60, 61, before he starts getting too far out, Yusef is a great guy to dive into with some of those same edges, but still with a lot of the same grooves and feel. This is A117, A flat, G flat, and C. He's again playing several different instruments there: flute, tenor, and alto. Hugh Lawson, Reggie Workman, and Roy Brooks. Another great Impulse. So he makes a pretty long string of recordings at Impulse. That's high quality stuff. And then in the late 60s, probably 67, he comes over to Atlantic. And the complete Yusef LATEEF 1499, Yusef LATEEF Sweet 16, 1563, 1548, the diverse Yusef LATEEF, the blue Yusef LATEEF. And it's around this time where Yusef kind of starts going back to his roots a little bit and delving into the blues and the gospel and the sounds of Detroit. And in life, we kind of always do end up going full circle to some degree. And so here we are, this is the blues. Probably 1968, yep. And there's always still going to be an element of that world thing just based on the music instruments he plays. But this is all also going back more to the spirituals and the gospel and the church. Anyway, so that wraps up my Yusef LATEEF. He ends up recording throughout the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s. I think he passes in 2010, and he's making records all the way through 2009. A lot of them are on the YAL label, and I've heard some of them on Spotify and on Pandora, but I don't have a lot of jazz that's not on vinyl. And I don't have a lot of time to listen to jazz that's not on vinyl because I got so much vinyl I need to listen to. So I don't really know his later stuff too much, but from what I've read and what I've heard, he kind of always maintains elements of that world new age sound. He incorporates some new age instruments and rhythms even into some of his later 70s and 80s stuff. He's always going to go back to the blues and the gospel at times. He's one of the true greats of this music, and he's kind of a little under the radar for some people. And if you don't want too much edge in your music, he might be a little edgy for you. But if you do like some edge, he's perfect for you. And if you like a lot of edge, he'll be a great place for you to go to get away from too much edge. So Yusef's a great player, a great part of the jazz chapter, and it's part of the story of Detroit. These are the sons of Detroit after all. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace.